Waitress overhears the CEO phone call. Mia Vanzetti froze when she heard the desperate billionaire at table 4 agree to a merger that was actually a trap. She knew she should stay silent, but kindness forced her to whisper a warning that stopped his pen. The next day, he returned to the restaurant with an offer that would rewrite her destiny. Before we start, your support means everything to us. Like, comment, and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories like this. The crystal chandeliers of La Dolce Vita cast a warm, deceptive glow over the dinner rush, masking the exhaustion etched into Mia Vancetti's face as she balanced a heavy tray of antipasto. To the wealthy patrons of Chicago's Gold Coast, she was nothing more than a pair of hands in a burgundy uniform, a silent fixture expected to refill wine glasses and disappear. They saw the apron, but they missed the eyes that scanned the room with the precision of a forensic accountant, a habit Mia could not break even 3 years after her life had been dismantled. She moved through the crowded dining room, weaving between tables with practiced grace, though her mind was miles away, calculating the tip percentages against her overdue rent. The restaurant was a symphony of clinking silverware and murmuring voices, a world of excess that she had once belonged to before. Dominic Rousseau destroyed her reputation and left her with nothing but a criminal record for a crime she did not commit. Now, at 28, she was invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of the elite world she used to audit. The heavy oak doors swung open, admitting a gust of bitter wind and a man who instantly sucked the oxygen out of the room. Julian Barone, the CEO of Barone Logistics, looked like he had not slept in a week. His charcoal suit was impeccable, costing more than Mia made in 6 months, yet he wore it like armor against an unseen enemy. He bypassed the fawning maitre d' with a curt nod, marching straight to table 4, the most secluded spot in the establishment. Mia felt a pang of sympathy as she watched him collapse into the leather booth. He did not look like a billionaire titan of industry, but like a man cornered. She approached with a pitcher of iced water, her presence barely registering as he immediately pulled a phone from his jacket pocket, his fingers white-knuckled around the device. As she poured the water, Julian spoke into the receiver, his voice a low, desperate rasp that carried clearly to her ears. "I am telling you, the merger is our only option." He hissed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I will sign the Vanguard contract tonight. Yes, I saw the asset valuation clause for the Malta subsidiary." "It is standard." Mia froze, the water pitcher hovering mid-air as a chill colder than the Chicago wind pierced her spine. That phrase, asset valuation clause for the Malta subsidiary, was not standard. It was a specific, malicious financial structure known in the dark corners of forensic accounting as the Ghost Protocol. It was the exact complex mechanism Dominic had used to siphon millions and frame her, a trap designed to strip a company of its liquid assets seconds after a signature was placed. Julian Barone was not saving his company. He was about to hand the keys to a thief who would hollow it out from the inside. Mia stood rooted to the spot near the service station, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched Julian reach for a gold fountain pen, the very instrument of his destruction, while the person on the other end of the line urged him to commit. The trauma of her own fall rose up like bile, the courtrooms, the shame, the loss of her license. She knew the safe choice was to walk away, to remain the invisible waitress and let this stranger make his own mistakes. But as she looked at the exhaustion in Julian's eyes, the sheer weight of the responsibility he carried for his family's legacy, a fierce, reckless kindness ignited within her chest. She realized with terrifying clarity that she was the only person in the room, perhaps the only person in the city who understood the language of the weapon being pointed at his head. Mia gripped the mahogany service station counter until her knuckles turned white, the familiar sting of injustice burning behind her eyes as she watched Julian Barone hover his fountain pen over the contract. She knew that silence was the currency of survival in her new life, yet she also knew that letting a good man walk into a buzzsaw when she held the kill switch was a sin she could not live with. Her breath hitched in her throat as she made a split-second decision that felt dangerously like jumping off a cliff. With a trembling hand, she pulled a heavy, cream-colored coaster from her apron pocket and uncapped her ordering pen. Pressing down hard enough to indent the cardboard, she scribbled a frantic message, her forensic shorthand flowing automatically. "Check the Malta subsidiary tax ID. It does not exist. It is a trap." She took a steadying breath, smoothed her burgundy apron, and walked back toward table 4 with a bottle of Barolo, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Julian was still listening to the voice on the phone, his brow furrowed in concentration, completely unaware that he was staring into the abyss. "I am ready to authorize the transfer," Julian said, his voice tight with resignation, positioning the nib of his pen over the signature line. Mia moved with the fluid, practiced invisibility of a seasoned server. "More wine, sir," she whispered, her voice barely a tremor in the ambient noise. As she poured the ruby liquid, she slid the coaster face up beneath the stem, her fingers lingering for a fraction of a second too long. Julian glanced up, annoyed at the intrusion, his gray eyes flashing with impatience. For a heartbeat, their gazes locked, his stormy, hers pleading. She gave a microscopic nod before turning on her heel and retreating rapidly toward the kitchen, her pulse roaring like a jet engine. Julian watched the waitress hurry away, irritation flaring. But as he lifted his wine glass, the scrawled blue ink on the coaster caught his eye. He froze as the words registered. "Check the Malta subsidiary tax ID." It was a nonsensical command for a waitress to give, yet the specificity sent a cold spike of adrenaline through his veins. "Hold on," he commanded sharply, cutting off the caller. "I need a moment." Ignoring the protests, Julian set the glass down and woke his tablet screen. His fingers flew across the surface, accessing the global corporate registry database. He entered the alphanumeric tax string for the Malta entity listed in the contract. He hit search and waited, his breath held tight. The screen refreshed, blinking a single result in red. No record found. Entity invalid. The air left his lungs in a rush. The subsidiary was a ghost. If he had signed, the liquidity of Barone Logistics would have been transferred into a black hole within hours. He was not making a deal. He was being gutted. "Julian, are you there?" The voice on the phone asked. Julian stared at the coaster, realizing the handwriting was a lifeline thrown by a stranger who saw what his lawyers missed. "The deal is off," Julian said, his voice ice-cold. "Do not call me again." He ended the call and stood up, scanning the room frantically for the dark curls and the burgundy uniform, needing to find the woman who had just saved his empire, but the floor was empty of her presence. The following evening, the air inside La Dolce Vita was thick with tension as the manager, Marco, berated Mia near the kitchen doors for a minor billing error. She stared at the floor, calculating how many shifts she needed to cover rent, feeling the suffocating weight of her invisibility. Suddenly, the restaurant's chatter died as the heavy oak doors swung open to reveal Julian Barone. He strode in, flanked by 2 sharp assistants, looking not like the desperate man from the night before, but like a king returning to claim his territory. He wore a navy bespoke suit that commanded absolute attention. Marco immediately rushed forward, his demeanor shifting from bully to sycophant. "Mr. Barone, welcome back. Right this way." Julian did not even glance at the man. His steely gaze locked onto Mia across the room, piercing through the crowd. He walked past the stunned maitre d', marching straight to her humble station where she stood frozen, clutching a water pitcher like a shield. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced the cream-colored coaster, placing it gently but firmly on the white tablecloth between them. Where does a waitress at a local Italian restaurant learn about complex offshore tax protocols? Julian asked, his voice low and intense. She tried to deflect, her heart racing against her ribs. I just heard it on the news, sir. Julian shook his head slowly, a ghost of a smile touching his lips as he studied her intelligent eyes. Do not lie to me. You saved my legacy. He pulled out a chair, ignoring the stunned patrons watching them. I do not want the special today. I want answers. Please, sit down. Mia glanced nervously at the fuming manager near the kitchen, and then back at the billionaire waiting for an answer. Realizing that any conversation within earshot of the staff would cost her the job she desperately needed to survive. I cannot talk here, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clinking of silverware. Meet me in the alleyway behind the kitchen in 10 minutes. Julian gave a curt nod, standing up and buttoning his jacket with a fluidity that drew eyes from every corner of the room before striding out the front door to circle the building. 10 minutes later, Mia stepped out the heavy steel rear door, trading the warm, garlic-scented air of the restaurant for the biting chill of the Chicago night. The alley was gritty, smelling of wet asphalt and old refuse, a stark reality that contrasted violently with the velvet luxury inside. Julian was already there, leaning against the damp brick wall, looking entirely out of place in his bespoke suit, yet his posture remained commanding. He pushed off the wall as she approached, his gray eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. You did not learn about complex offshore subsidiary structuring on the evening news, Julian said, his tone leaving no room for evasion. That was forensic-level insight. Who are you? Mia shivered, wrapping her thin cardigan tighter around herself, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed the mask of the simple waitress to slip. Her posture straightened, the slump of servitude vanishing to reveal a spine of steel. It is called a ghost protocol, she said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming crisp and authoritative. The tax ID you checked belongs to a dormant entity that was programmed to mirror an active corporation for exactly 48 hours. If you had signed that contract, the liquidity from your accounts would have been routed through Malta to a blind trust in the Caymans before the ink was dry. Julian stared at her, stunned by the sudden transformation. The woman standing before him was no longer serving tables. She was lecturing him on high-level corporate espionage. You recognize the routing structure? He asked, genuinely amazed. I recognized the syntax of the fraud, Mia corrected him, her eyes flashing with a brilliance she usually kept hidden. Vanguard is not a holding company, Mr. Barone. It is a liquidation engine designed to strip assets from distressed legacies. I saw the same code used to dismantle a tech firm 3 years ago. The silence that followed was heavy with the hum of distant traffic. Julian looked at the woman in the stained burgundy apron, seeing for the first time the genius mind trapped beneath the uniform. He took a step closer, his curiosity burning brighter than his gratitude. You possess a mind that belongs in a boardroom, not clearing plates, he said softly, shaking his head in disbelief. So I have to ask, who are you really, and why are you serving pasta? Julian Barone did not wait for Mia to explain the tragedy of her resume before making a decision that would alter both their trajectories, his executive instinct recognizing an asset that was being criminally underutilized. Standing amidst the steam rising from the alley vents, he reached into his inner pocket and produced a sleek, heavy card embossed with his family crest, holding it out not as a mere professional courtesy, but as a desperate lifeline. I do not care about your serving history or why you are currently pouring wine, Julian stated with the absolute confidence of a man who moved markets with a whisper. I have an entire legal department staffed with Ivy League graduates that failed to spot what you saw in 3 seconds. I need you to consult for Baroni Logistics starting immediately to help me untangle the rest of this Vanguard mess and find out who is targeting my family. He paused, his gaze assessing her worn shoes and the exhaustion etched around her eyes. I will pay you triple whatever you make here in a year for 1 month of work, plus a bonus. The offer hung in the cold air, a dazzling escape hatch from her purgatory, and for a moment, Mia felt a surge of desperate hope, so painful it nearly brought her to her knees. But reality crashed back down with crushing weight. In the corporate world, she was toxic, a convicted felon on paper. She took a step back, refusing to take the card, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. I cannot work for you, Mr. Barone, she said, her voice trembling with the effort to maintain her composure. If your HR department runs a standard background check, they will flag me before I even walk through the doors. Julian frowned, confused by her resistance. Why? What will they find? Mia looked down at the dirty asphalt, shame burning her cheeks as she forced the words out. Embezzlement, she whispered, the ugly word tasting like ash. I have a criminal record for stealing client funds. I am unhireable. She waited for him to recoil, to look at her with the same disgust the judge had shown 3 years ago. But when the silence stretched too long, she finally looked up. Julian was not looking at her with judgment. He was looking at her with a fierce, unwavering intensity that made her heart stutter. A thief would have let me sign that contract and then shorted my stock, Julian said firmly, stepping closer and pressing the card into her reluctant hand. A criminal would have asked for a payoff. You asked for nothing. He held her gaze, stripping away the label society had branded her with. I do not care what a piece of paper says about your past, he declared, his voice low and rough with emotion. I care about the woman who had the integrity to save a stranger when she had nothing to gain. My offer stands, Mia. Trust me. Do not let a lie define your future. Julian's absolute trust acted as a key, unlocking the heavy door Mia had kept bolted for 3 agonizing years. The cold wind whipped through the alley, blowing a stray curl across her face, but she made no move to brush it away, her focus entirely on the man who offered salvation when she expected condemnation. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the steam rising from her lips like a ghost of the life she used to lead, and decided to trust him with the wreckage of her past. It was not a random error or a lapse in judgment. She began, her voice gaining strength as the truth finally found a way out. I was a senior forensic accountant at a top-tier firm, and I was engaged to be married to my business partner, Dominic Russo. Julian's expression darkened instantly at the name, a flicker of recognition or perhaps just instinctive revulsion at the raw pain vibrating in her voice. We were building a life together, or so I thought, she continued, looking past Julian at the damp brick wall, unable to meet his eyes as she recounted the shame. I discovered massive discrepancies in our largest client account. Millions were being siphoned off into offshore shell companies using the Ghost Protocol. I thought I was protecting us when I brought the evidence to him. She laughed bitterly, a sharp, jagged sound that echoed in the narrow space. I was incredibly naive. Dominic was the one stealing it. When I confronted him, he did not deny it. He just smiled and told me I should have looked at my own hard drive. Mia wrapped her arms around herself, physically holding herself together as she relived the moment her world collapsed. He had planted the encryption keys on my private server weeks in advance. He turned the partners against me, testified that I was the mastermind, and played the heartbroken fiancé who had been duped. I lost my CPA license, my savings, my reputation, my entire life. She finally looked back at Julian, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I did not steal a dime, Mr. Barone. I was erased by the person I trusted most. Julian listened with a stillness that was profound, his gray eyes softening not with pity, but with a simmering, protective anger that seemed to raise the temperature in the alley. He did not question her narrative. He absorbed it, his jaw tightening as he realized the magnitude of the injustice she had survived. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder before resting gently on her arm, a grounding touch in the swirling chaos of her memory. Dominic Rousseau is a coward who used your brilliance to cover his crimes, Julian said, his voice low and vibrating with a dangerous promise. But he made a fatal calculation. He assumed you would stay broken forever. Julian stepped closer, his imposing presence shielding her from the biting wind. You are not alone in this fight anymore. I believe you, Mia. Completely. The weight of his belief settled over her, lighter than air but stronger than steel. We are going to clear your name, he vowed. And then we are going to make sure Dominic Rousseau never destroys anyone else again. Monday morning broke over Chicago, reflecting off the glass facade of the Barone Logistics headquarters and turning the skyscraper into a pillar of fire that seemed to burn away the last remnants of the invisible Waitress. Mia Vansetti stood on the pavement, smoothing the lapels of a charcoal wool pantsuit she had pulled from the deepest recesses of her wardrobe, a garment that smelled of cedar and lost ambition. It was the armor of her former life, and as she fastened the jacket, she felt the ghost of the brilliant forensic accountant settling back into her skin. She walked through the revolving doors with the rhythmic, purposeful stride of a woman who charged by the hour. The lobby was a cavernous expanse of polished marble, a cathedral of commerce that usually intimidated outsiders, but Mia breathed in the scent of filtered air and expensive coffee like oxygen. Julian Barone was waiting by the security turnstiles. When he saw her, he straightened, his gray eyes widening as they swept over her transformation. The pity that often lingered in the eyes of men who knew her story was absent, replaced by profound respect. He stepped forward to meet her halfway, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by the reception staff who paused their typing to watch. I almost did not recognize you without the apron, Julian said, his voice low and intimate. You look dangerous, Miss Vansetti. She met his gaze evenly, her heart beating a steady war drum rhythm. I am dangerous, Julian, she corrected him softly. To people who have something to hide, he smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes, and gestured for her to precede him through the gates. Then let us go hunting. As they walked side by side toward the executive elevators, a hush fell over the clustered employees. Mia held her head high as whispers trailed in their wake like the wake of a ship. They ascended 40 floors in silence. When the doors opened onto the C-suite, the atmosphere shifted to high-stakes tension. Julian led her directly into the glass-walled boardroom, where his finance team was arguing over the Vanguard contract. The conversation died instantly. Julian moved to the head of the table but did not sit. Instead, he placed a hand on the back of the empty leather chair to his right. Gentlemen, stop talking, Julian commanded, his voice slicing through the room. This is Mia Vansetti. She is my special advisor. A lawyer opened his mouth to object, eyeing her lack of a badge, but Julian silenced him with a glare. She has absolute clearance. If she asks for a file, you provide it. If she asks for a server log, you decrypt it. She is the only person in this room who saw the iceberg before we hit it. Mia stepped forward, placing her hands on the table, feeling the cool wood beneath her palms. Good morning, she said, her voice steel-hard. We have work to do. The days blurred seamlessly into nights inside the penthouse office of Barone Logistics, the glittering city lights of Chicago serving as a silent, watchful backdrop to a frantic symphony of forensic auditing. Mia and Julian worked in a synchronized rhythm that usually took partners years to develop, their minds locking together over complex spreadsheets and encrypted ledgers. The stiff, formal barriers of the boardroom had dissolved into the comfortable intimacy of shared purpose, with take-out cartons of pad thai scattered across the expansive mahogany desk, a humorous, deliberate reversal of roles where Julian poured her coffee while she dissected the financial anatomy of his enemies. "You need to eat something," Julian murmured, sliding a carton gently toward her as she squinted at a cascading waterfall of routing numbers on the large monitor. "I cannot run a global logistics company with a starved special advisor." Mia smiled, taking a forkful without looking away from the screen, the genuine warmth of his concern grounding her in the storm of data. "I am close, Julian. I can feel it," she replied, her voice hushed with intense concentration. "The Vanguard Shell Company is not just a random algorithm generated by a machine. It has a human fingerprint, a specific style of hiding assets. For hours, the only sounds in the room were the low hum of the hard drives and the soft, rhythmic scratch of Mia's pen, the atmosphere charging with an electric tension that was part intellectual thrill and part undeniable. Growing attraction. Julian watched her work, marveling at how the timid waitress in the burgundy apron had vanished completely to reveal this formidable, brilliant creature of intellect. But the cozy, collaborative warmth of the room shattered instantly when Mia hit the enter key on a decrypted metadata file. Her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sharp gasp that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Oh my God," she whispered, her face draining of all color as she stared at the digital signature embedded deep in the shell company's coding. Julian was at her side in a single heartbeat, his hand gripping the back of her leather chair, his body tense. "What is it? What did you find?" Mia pointed a trembling finger at the screen, where a complex alphanumeric string finally resolved into a hidden ownership tag. "It is not just a similarity, Julian. It is a signature." She turned to look up at him, her eyes wide with a terrifying realization that turned her blood to ice. The coding syntax, the specific routing through Malta, the timestamp patterns. "I know this architect intimately." She swallowed hard, the ghost of her past materializing in the room to choke her. "Vanguard is not a faceless corporation trying to acquire you. It is Dominic Russo." The name hung in the air between them like toxic smoke. "My ex-fiancé is not just the man who destroyed me," she said, her voice shaking with a volatile mix of fear and fury. "He is the one coming for your entire empire." The heavy glass doors of the executive suite slid open with a soft hiss, admitting the man who had haunted Mia Vanchetti's nightmares for 3 agonizing years, though today he walked not as a phantom, but as a predator in a flashy, pinstriped suit that screamed new money and old corruption. Dominic Russo strode into the Baroni Logistics boardroom with the arrogant, loose-limbed swagger of a man who believed he had already won the war and was simply arriving to collect the spoils of total surrender. He checked his heavy gold watch ostentatiously, flashing a blinding, practiced smile at the assembled lawyers who sat in tense, stone-faced silence around the long mahogany table. Julian Barone sat at the head, perfectly still, his hands resting flat on the polished wood, his face a mask of polite indifference that barely concealed the lethal protective rage simmering beneath the surface. Dominic pulled out the chair opposite Julian, ignoring the distinct chill in the room, and placed a leather portfolio on the table with a heavy, authoritative thud. "Julian, good to see you," Dominic said, his voice smooth and oily, lacking the genuine warmth he faked so well during his con games. "I trust your legal team has finally finished reviewing the Vanguard proposal. I have a dinner reservation at 7, so I would prefer to wrap this acquisition up quickly." He looked around the room, his eyes sliding dismissively over the staff, expecting to see defeat and submission. Julian did not reach for the pen. Instead, he leaned back, steepling his fingers with deliberate slowness. "Actually, Mr. Russo, we have hit a slight snag," Julian replied, his tone conversational but laced with razor-sharp steel. "My new lead auditor found some fascinating anomalies in the asset valuation clauses regarding the subsidiary in Malta. I insisted she explain them to you personally before we proceed." Dominic's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of genuine annoyance crossing his perfectly groomed face. "Auditor?" "Julian, we are at the signing stage. Bringing in lower management at the 11th hour is a waste of my time and yours." Julian gestured to the high-backed leather chair at the far end of the table, which had been turned to face the floor-to-ceiling windows, concealing its occupant from view. "She is hardly lower management, Dominic. She is the only person who understands your unique accounting methods intimately." At the signal, the leather chair slowly swiveled around. Mia sat with her legs crossed, wearing the charcoal armor of her pantsuit, her face composed in an expression of terrifying, judicial calm. The color drained from Dominic's face instantly, his mouth opening and closing as his brain struggled to process the impossible sight of the woman he destroyed, sitting at the right hand of the billionaire he was trying to rob. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled. Mia locked eyes with him, holding his gaze until he flinched. "Hello, Dominic," she said, her voice steady and echoing with the weight of 3 years of silence. "It has been a while. I believe we have some tax shelters to discuss." Julian declared a 15-minute recess to allow opposing counsel to review the discrepancies, a tactical maneuver designed to let the pressure cooker explode. But for Mia, the sudden break in momentum felt like the floor dropping out from under her. She gathered her files with trembling hands and exited the boardroom, desperate for the sanctuary of the washroom to splash cold water on her burning face and steady the tremors racking her body. The executive corridor was a narrow, soundproofed tunnel of hushed beige carpet and abstract art, usually a place of quiet power, but today it felt like a trap. She was reaching for the handle of the restroom door when a heavy hand slammed against the wall, inches from her face, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. Mia gasped and spun around, her back hitting the silk wallpaper as Dominic Russo boxed her in, his expensive Italian loafers invading her personal space. The charming, bewildered executive from the boardroom was gone, replaced instantly by the sneering, predatory narcissist she remembered with terrifying clarity. "You have some nerve showing your face in this zip code, let alone at this negotiation table," Dominic hissed, his voice a low, venomous rumble that made her skin crawl. "Did you honestly think a new haircut and a billionaire boyfriend would erase the fact that you are a convicted felon?" Mia tried to summon the courage she had displayed moments ago, but in the claustrophobic shadow of his physical intimidation, she felt small and fractured. "I am not the person you framed anymore, Dominic," she said, her voice wavering dangerously. "Julian knows the truth." Dominic threw his head back and laughed, a cruel, jagged sound that echoed off the walls. "He knows the pathetic sob story you fed him to get into his bed," he spat, leaning in so close she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "But the world sees a thief. Listen to me closely, Mia. If you do not walk back in there and tell the board you made a calculation error, I will leak your mugshot to every financial blog in the country. I will paint Julian as a fool who hired an embezzler to cook his books, and I will destroy his reputation just like I destroyed yours." He grabbed her upper arm, his fingers digging painfully into the wool of her suit, analyzing her fear with the cold detachment of a butcher. "I hold all the cards here. Who do you think the SEC will believe? The CEO of a billion-dollar holding company, or a desperate, disgraced waitress with a criminal record?" The threat wrapped around her throat like a physical noose, triggering a landslide of traumatic memories, the gavel banging down, the handcuffs, the shame, and for a terrifying second, Mia believed him. Mia wrenched her arm free from Dominic's grasp and bolted toward the sanctuary of the executive washroom, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the marble floor before she shoved the heavy door locked with a trembling hand. She collapsed against the cool granite vanity, her reflection in the mirror fractured and pale, a ghost of the confident woman who had marched into the boardroom just an hour ago. Now she was replaced by the terrified victim who had lost everything 3 years ago to a man who viewed destruction as a sport. Her lungs seized, the air refusing to enter, as Dominic's venomous threats echoed in her skull like a death knell. He would destroy Julian. He would drag them both down into the mud of scandal, and he would win again. She splashed freezing water onto her burning face, trying desperately to wash away the phantom sensation of his fingers digging into her arm. But the panic was a rising tide she could not swim against. She needed to leave, to disappear back into the anonymity of the service industry, to save Julian from the collateral damage of her wrecked reputation. She dried her face with a shaking hand and pulled the door open, intending to run for the elevators, but she collided instantly with a wall of solid charcoal wool. Julian was standing guard in the corridor, his arms crossed, his posture radiating tension. He took one look at her ashen face and the terror swimming in her eyes, and he stepped forward immediately. "Mia," he said softly, reaching for her, but she flinched back as if physically burned. "I cannot do this," she gasped, backing away until she hit the corridor wall, hugging herself defensively. "He is right, Julian. I am a toxic liability. If I stay, he will use my criminal record to tank your stock price. You need to fire me right now." She tried to push past him, but Julian caught her shoulders, his grip firm and grounding, anchoring her to the present moment. He forced her to look at him, his gray eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering certainty. "Stop," he commanded, his voice low and vibrating with intensity. "Listen to me. Dominic Russo does not hold the power here anymore. You do." Mia shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "He will ruin you to get to me." Julian stepped closer, eliminating the space between them, becoming a human shield against the world. "Let him try," Julian vowed, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. "I did not hire a victim. I hired the only person smart enough to outthink him. You are not fighting him alone anymore. You have me, my resources, and the truth." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers for a brief, electric moment. "We are going to walk back in there, and you are going to finish what you started." The adrenaline from the corridor transformed into a cold, diamond-hard focus as Mia and Julian retreated to the sanctuary of the executive suite to engineer their counterstrike. The city of Chicago slept beneath them, but inside the penthouse office, the air crackled with the electric hum of a high-stakes heist being planned in reverse. Mia paced the length of the Persian rug, her mind disassembling Dominic's psychological profile with surgical precision. "He is a narcissist," she told Julian, stopping to tap the glass whiteboard where they had mapped out the Vanguard structure. "He believes he broke me in that hallway. He is expecting us to return to the table desperate to salvage a deal, willing to make concessions to keep him quiet." Julian leaned back in his leather chair, watching her with undisguised awe. "So we feed his ego," he concluded, his voice low. "We give him a victory that is actually a cage." Mia nodded, a dangerous smile touching her lips for the first time. "Exactly. We draft a new addendum. We call it the Liquidity Assurance Clause. It will look like we are capitulating to his demand for immediate asset transfer." She grabbed a dry erase marker and began sketching the legal framework furiously. "But buried in the compliance definitions, we insert a reciprocal audit trigger. By signing to accept our assets, He legally authorizes a full forensic sweep of the receiving accounts to verify anti-money laundering compliance. Julian stood up and moved to stand beside her, reading the fine print she was proposing. "A Trojan horse," he whispered, realizing the brilliance of the maneuver. "He will be so eager to swallow the company, he will not notice he is swallowing poison." For the next 6 hours, they worked in a feverish synchronization, drafting the lethal contract language. The atmosphere shifted from professional to something profoundly intimate, the boundaries between CEO and waitress dissolving completely until they were just two partners building a weapon out of words. As the sun began to bleed gray light over the horizon, Mia printed the final document, her hands steady. "If he signs this," she said quietly, holding the paper like a loaded gun, "he gives us the legal right to expose every dollar he has ever stolen, including the ones he stole from me." Julian took the document, his fingers brushing hers, sending a jolt of heat through them both. "He will sign it," Julian promised, looking at her with an intensity that burned hotter than the sunrise. "Because he thinks you are weak, and he thinks I am a fool, and that arrogance is going to cost him everything." The morning sun filtered through the blinds of the Barone Logistics boardroom, but it offered no warmth to the frozen tableau assembled around the mahogany table. Dominic Russo returned from his victory lap coffee break with a swagger that sucked the air out of the room, his eyes immediately darting to the high-backed leather chair at the far end of the table. It was empty. The charcoal pantsuit and the terrifyingly competent woman were gone, leaving only a void that Dominic interpreted as total unconditional surrender. A cruel, satisfied smile spread across his face as he dropped his heavy frame into the seat opposite Julian Barone. "I see you finally decided to take out the trash," Dominic drawled, gesturing lazily to the vacant seat with a dismissal that made the hair on Julian's neck stand up. "Smart move, Julian. A man in your position cannot afford to be seen taking financial advice from a convicted felon. I assume she is back clearing tables where she belongs." Julian sat like a statue carved from granite, his face betraying absolutely nothing as he pushed the thick stack of revised contracts across the polished wood. "We have accepted your terms regarding the liquidity transfer," Julian said, his voice flat and defeated playing the part of the cornered prey to perfection. "The new addendum is on page 40. We just want to conclude this business and sever ties." Dominic laughed, a sharp bark of triumph, and pulled the documents toward him with greedy hands. He scanned the liquidity assurance clause that Mia and Julian had spent the night crafting, his eyes lighting up as he read the language that seemingly gave him immediate access to the Barone accounts. Blinded by his own narcissism, he glossed over the dense compliance paragraphs where the audit trigger lay buried like a landmine, waiting for a single misstep. "This is much better," Dominic murmured, tapping the paper with his gold ring. "See how easy business can be when you stop listening to hysterical women." The lawyers around the table shifted uncomfortably, looking anywhere but at the two men, but Julian did not flinch, though his hands were clenched into fists beneath the table, his knuckles white with the effort to restrain his fury. Dominic reached into his jacket pocket and produced his heavy gold fountain pen, the nib glinting in the sunlight, mirroring the exact moment at the restaurant that had started this entire war. "You are lucky I am a forgiving man," Dominic sneered, unscrewing the cap with agonizing slowness, savoring his dominance. "I could have destroyed you for that stunt earlier. But I suppose taking your company will be punishment enough." He lowered the pen to the signature line, the silence in the room stretching until it hummed with unbearable tension, a physical weight pressing down on everyone present. Julian watched the ink hover millimeters from the paper, his heart pounding a deafening rhythm against his ribs, waiting for the trap to snap shut, praying that Mia's timing was as impeccable as her accounting. The nib of Dominic's heavy gold pen made contact with the crisp white paper, creating a microscopic black dot that marked the beginning of the end. But before he could complete the first arrogant loop of his signature, the double mahogany doors of the boardroom crashed open with a thunderous boom that shook the glass walls. Dominic flinched, his pen dragging a jagged, ugly line across the page, and whipped his head around, his face twisting into a snarl of annoyance that froze instantly into a mask of pure, unadulterated disbelief. Mia Vansetti stood in the doorway, but she was no longer the trembling woman from the hallway or the invisible waitress from the restaurant. She was a force of nature wrapped in charcoal wool, flanked by three grim-faced individuals, wearing government-issued lanyards and carrying heavy accordion files, stamped with the seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. She stepped into the room with the terrifying silence of a predator, the rhythmic click of her heels, the only sound in the stunned chamber, until she stood at the opposite end of the long table, staring down the man who had stolen her life with a gaze that could strip paint from the walls. "I would not sign that if I were you, Dominic," Mia announced, her voice ringing out with crystal clarity, echoing the very warning she had scrawled on the coaster just 48 hours prior. "Unless, of course, you are eager to authorize a federal audit of your personal holdings." Dominic scrambled to his feet, his chair screeching violently backward against the floor, his face flushing a violent shade of crimson, as the illusion of his absolute control shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Security!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation, pointing a shaking finger at her. "Get this hysterical woman out of here. She is trespassing. She is a convicted criminal trying to sabotage a billion-dollar deal." But the uniformed security guards standing by the door did not move a muscle, their arms crossed stoically over their chests, their eyes fixed on Julian, who remained seated, calm and immovable as a mountain. "She is not trespassing," Julian said, his voice cutting through Dominic's shouting like a surgical blade. "She is the only reason you are not currently in handcuffs, though that is about to change in exactly 2 minutes. Mia walked slowly toward Dominic, ignoring his sputtering rage, her gaze locked on his with a terrifying intensity that made the high-priced lawyers scramble to gather their papers and distance themselves from the blast zone. "You told me in the hallway that you hold all the cards," she said, tossing a thick stack of files onto the table, where they landed with a heavy, damning thud that made the water glasses tremble. "But you forgot that I was the one who taught you how to play the game." She placed her hands on the table, leaning in until she was inches from his frantic face. "I am not here to negotiate, Dominic. I am here to balance the ledger." Mia ignored the chaotic murmurs of the terrified lawyers and calmly connected her silver laptop to the boardroom's main projection system with a steady hand that betrayed none of the trauma she had carried for 3 years. The massive screen behind Julian flickered to life, bathing the dim room in the harsh, unforgiving light of raw data, displaying a complex, spider-webbed diagram that traced the flow of capital through the Vanguard holding company like a roadmap of corruption. Dominic flinched as if physically struck, instantly recognizing the digital architecture of his own crimes, blown up to 20 feet high for the federal agents to dissect. "This is unauthorized access," Dominic screamed, slamming his fist onto the mahogany table, his composure fracturing completely into panic. "Turn that off immediately. You are violating corporate privacy laws." He lunged desperately toward the console to rip the HDMI cable out, but Julian Barone rose from his seat with terrifying speed, catching Dominic's wrist in a grip of iron before he could touch the equipment. "Sit down, Dominic," Julian commanded, his voice a low rumble of thunder that vibrated in the floorboards and silenced the room. "You wanted to verify the assets?" "We are verifying them." He shoved Dominic back into his chair with a force that rattled the man's teeth. Mia did not flinch during the physical altercation. She simply pressed a key, and the diagram animated, vivid red lines shooting across the map from Chicago to Malta to the Cayman Islands. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Mia began, her voice projecting the absolute authority of a woman who had memorized every cent of the theft during her years in exile. "What you are looking at is not a standard merger-acquisition structure, it is a siphon." She pointed to a cluster of nodes dated 3 years prior. "This is the Ghost Protocol. You can see here where client funds were diverted from the escrow accounts into a shell entity registered to a frantic LLC in Panama." Dominic's face turned the color of old ash, sweat beading on his forehead. "That is a lie. She cooked those numbers to save her job." Mia pressed another key, and a new window popped up, displaying a digital timestamp and a unique IP address. "This is the authorization log for the transfer that framed me 3 years ago." She continued, looking directly at the SEC agents who were taking furious notes. "Dominic claimed I made these transfers from my workstation. But this metadata proves the command was executed from an administrative account that only one person possessed." She turned to face Dominic, whose arrogance had dissolved into sheer terror. "Yours." The silence that followed was absolute, the sound of a reputation dying in real time. "And here," Mia said, highlighting a pending transaction queue dated for that very morning, "is the command you queued up to drain Barone Logistics the moment the ink was dry on the contract." The board members gasped, looking from the screen to the sweating man at the table with dawning horror. Mia closed her laptop with a soft click that sounded like a gavel falling. "You did not just steal money from your clients, Dominic. You stole my life, my reputation, and my future, and today I am taking it all back with interest." The silence in the boardroom following Mia Vansetti's final declaration was shattered by the scrape of heavy chairs against the floor as the 3 federal agents moved in with the synchronized precision of a closing steel trap. The lead agent, a stern woman with a silver badge clipped to her belt, stepped around the mahogany table while Dominic Russo stared at the projection screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land, unable to comprehend that his meticulously constructed house of cards had been incinerated by the very woman he had discarded as collateral damage. "Dominic Russo," the agent announced, her voice flat and bored, as if she were reading a grocery list rather than ending a high-profile career. "You are under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft." Dominic recoiled as she reached for the handcuffs at her belt, stumbling back against the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city he believed he owned. "This is a setup," he shrieked, his composure disintegrating into a pathetic, frantic mess of sweat and denial. "You cannot arrest me. I am the CEO of Vanguard. My lawyers will have your badges for this." He turned wildly to his legal team, a phalanx of 5 high-priced sharks who had been smirking just 10 minutes ago. "Do not just stand there. Fix this. Tell them who I am." But the lead attorney simply closed his leather briefcase with a snap that sounded final, taking a deliberate step away from his screaming client to distance himself from the blast radius. "We represent the Vanguard Corporation, Mr. Russo," the lawyer said coldly, checking his watch with indifferent precision. "Not you personally, and given the evidence Ms. Vansetti just presented, I would advise you to save your breath for a public defender." The betrayal hit Dominic harder than the metal cuffs that snapped around his wrists a second later, the sharp click echoing through the stunned room like a gunshot. As the agents hauled him toward the double doors, he thrashed and cursed, his eyes locking onto Mia with a hatred that burned. But she did not flinch. She did not smile, nor did she gloat. She simply watched him be dragged away, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the last 3 years lifting off her shoulders, leaving her light-headed and trembling. It was not triumph she felt, but a profound, hollowed-out peace, the quiet that comes after a hurricane finally passes. The board members, who had looked at her with suspicion only an hour ago, now stared with a mixture of shame and awe, realizing they owed their remaining fortunes to the courage of a woman they would have dismissed as waitstaff. Julian Baroni moved to her side, placing a warm, solid hand on the small of her back, a physical anchor in the shifting room. He did not look at the door where his enemy had vanished. He looked only at her. "It is over," Julian whispered, his voice rough with emotion, shielding her from the stares of the room. "He can never hurt you again." The chaos of the boardroom slowly dissipated as the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the last federal agent, leaving a ringing silence in the executive suite that felt heavier than the noise of the arrest. Julian Barone did not say a word immediately. Instead, he guided Mia gently by the elbow toward the private glass doors that led to the expansive executive terrace. They stepped out into the cool, biting air of the Chicago afternoon, the wind whipping around them and stripping away the sterile atmosphere of the corporate battleground they had just survived. Below them, the city sprawled like a grid of diamonds and steel, the traffic moving in silent rivers of light, indifferent to the drama that had just unfolded 40 floors up. But, to Mia, the view looked different today. It looked like a place she finally belonged to again. She leaned against the railing, taking a deep, shuddering breath that filled her lungs with oxygen that tasted sweet and clean, free from the toxic smoke of Dominic's influence. Julian stood beside her, leaning his elbows on the cold metal, looking out at the gray horizon rather than at her, giving her the privacy to reassemble her fractured composure. "You did not just save the company today, Mia," Julian said finally, his voice low and vibrating with a raw sincerity that made her turn to face him. "You saved my family's legacy from being hollowed out by a parasite. But more importantly, you saved me from becoming the kind of man who is too cynical to listen to a warning because of the uniform the messenger is wearing." Mia shook her head, a humble, tired smile touching her lips. "I just did the math, Julian. The numbers tell the truth even when people lie." Julian reached into his inner suit jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with the wax crest of his private legal counsel. "The numbers are not the only thing that tells the truth," he replied, handing her the heavy packet with a solemnity that made her heart race. "My legal team has been working on this since the moment you told me your story in the alleyway. We expedited the filing this morning while you were preparing the trap." Mia took the envelope, her fingers trembling as she broke the seal and slid out the documents inside. She scanned the top page, and her breath hitched in her throat, a sob escaping before she could stop it. It was a court order, signed by a federal judge, officially expunging her criminal record based on the new evidence of identity theft and coercion. Beneath it lay a letter from the State Board of Accountancy, confirming the immediate reinstatement of her CPA license with a formal apology for the wrongful revocation. "You gave me my life back," she whispered, looking up at him through a blur of tears, the paper shaking in her grasp. "No," Julian corrected her gently, stepping closer until the warmth of his body shielded her from the wind. "You fought for your life back. I just made sure the world acknowledged the victory." Mia held the heavy legal documents against her chest like a shield, the wind whipping her dark curls across her face, but for the first time in 3 long years, she felt anchored to the earth rather than adrift in a sea of shame. The silence between them on the terrace shifted, changing from the heavy camaraderie of battle to something far more fragile, dangerous, and electric. Julian took a deliberate step closer, encroaching on her personal space in a way that had nothing to do with corporate strategy and everything to do with the magnetic pull that had been growing between them since that freezing night in the alleyway. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear that had escaped her control. The warm touch sent a jolt of electricity through her that silenced the noise of the traffic below. "So?" Mia breathed, her voice barely a whisper, trying to find her footing on this shifting ground while her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I suppose this means I am officially hired." "As your CFO?" Julian shook his head slowly, his grey eyes darkening as they dropped to her lips and then back up to her wide, questioning gaze. "I do not want you to be my CFO, Mia," he said, his voice low and rough, stripping away the polished veneer of the CEO to reveal the vulnerable man beneath. Mia's breath hitched, confusion and fear warring in her chest as the wind tugged at her jacket. "But," I thought, "I can hire a CFO anywhere." Julian interrupted softly, moving his other hand to rest on her waist, drawing her imperceptibly closer until they were sharing the same breath. "I can find 100 forensic accountants in this city who can balance a ledger. But I cannot find another woman who would risk her own safety to save a stranger just because it was the right thing to do." He leaned his forehead against hers, the contact burning like a brand against her cool skin. "I spent 10 years building this company, thinking that success was about assets and acquisitions. But when I saw you standing in that boardroom today, taking down a giant with nothing but the truth, I realized I have been building an empty castle." The vulnerability in his voice terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "Julian," she whispered, her hands finding their way to the lapels of his charcoal suit, clutching the wool as if to keep herself upright. "What are you saying?" Julian pulled back just enough to look deep into her soul, his expression open and unguarded. "I am saying that I found the best accountant in Chicago," he murmured, his gaze tracing the line of her jaw. "But I am hoping I also found the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with." The confession hung in the air, bolder and more reckless than any business deal he had ever made. Mia searched his face for any sign of hesitation, but found only absolute certainty. "That is a high-risk investment, Mr. Barone." She teased weakly, a fresh tear slipping free. "The returns are infinite," he countered. And then he closed the distance, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted of victory, relief, and a promise that she would never have to be invisible again. 6 months later, the sprawling ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton Chicago was awash in the golden glow of crystal chandeliers, mirroring the triumphant radiance of the woman standing at the center of the stage. Mia Vancetti, now the chief financial officer of Baroni Logistics, wore a floor-length emerald gown that shimmered under the lights, a stark and beautiful contrast to the burgundy apron she had worn for so many years in the shadows. The room was packed with the city's elite, but tonight they were not there to be served by her, they were there to listen to her. The inaugural Integrity in Business Gala had already raised $5 million for victims of corporate fraud, a cause that Mia had championed with fierce dedication since her own exoneration. Julian Barone stood in the wings, his eyes fixed on his wife with a look of reverence that made the other guests whisper in envy. He watched as Mia placed a hand subconsciously over the slight swell of her stomach, a secret they had shared only with each other that morning, confirming that the Baroni legacy would continue with a new generation. The massive diamond on her left ring finger caught the light, sending fractured rainbows dancing across the podium as she leaned into the microphone, commanding the room with effortless grace. "We often believe that power is defined by the money in our accounts or the titles on our doors," Mia said, her voice clear and carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "But I have learned that true power is the courage to speak the truth when your voice shakes, and the kindness to help a stranger when you have nothing left to give." The applause that followed was thunderous, a standing ovation that washed over her like a warm tide. Julian walked onto the stage to join her, taking her hand and kissing her knuckles before turning to the audience. "To the woman who saved my company with a single sentence," Julian toasted, raising his champagne glass high. "And to the future we are building together. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the lights dimmed, they returned to the quiet sanctuary of their penthouse office. There on the wall behind the massive mahogany desk hung a small, simple object, encased in an ornate gold frame. It was not a diploma or a stock certificate, but a cheap cream-colored drink coaster stained with a ring of red wine bearing a hurried scrawl in blue ink. Mia rested her head on Julian's shoulder, tracing the familiar words with her eyes, feeling the warmth of his arms around her and the new life growing inside her. She realized with a profound sense of peace that the coaster was not just a warning about a tax ID, but a map that had led her home. The invisible waitress was gone, forever replaced by a woman who had rewritten her own destiny, one sentence at a time. If Mia's journey from the shadows to the spotlight touched your heart, please light up that like button. It helps us verify that truth and justice still matter to our audience. Drop a comment below. Would you have dared to slide that coaster across the table? We want to hear your voice. Make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss the next chapter of redemption and romance we have waiting for you. And please, share this story with someone who feels invisible in their current job. Remind them that their intellect is a superpower and their entire destiny could change with just one honest whisper. Thank you for being part of our story.